second of a series of panels that the San Fernando Valley Sun, El newspaper, is holding, where the recipients of a state library grant to discuss the issue of words and language. Their beauty, complexity, their power and strength, also the hijacking, the danger and damage and weaponizing we've seen recently produced by the use of words and language. We specifically asked members of the community here today to participate as panelists and members of the audience to share your knowledge, your life experience, professionally and personally, about the impact that you found of the use of names and terms and language. So what better place to have this discussion today but in our own library located in Library Plaza, which is the center here in the city of San Fernando. We provided bios of our esteemed panelists for all of you, so please take a minute to read them about their impressive work. Our panelists will begin today with a 5-minute presentation, which will be followed up with one question that I will ask each of you based on your presentations. Then it will be followed up with questions from our audience participants, because we do want you to participate. Our publisher, Martha Diaz-Ashkenazi, will help to keep time. But panelists, please know that we want to allow you to share your information, and will allow you to complete your thought, and you'll have more time to respond during our question period. To begin the discussion, I would like to note that we are experiencing an all-time high in hate incidents and hate crimes that oftentimes begins with what people call each other, and therefore come to believe about each other as a result, which can dehumanize. At the same time, our particular culture as Latinos, using names and terms that are viewed as cariños, also referring to people and assigning nicknames based on how we look. We've heard them all our lives. People have referred to us as flaca, gorda, prieta, negra. The list is very, very long. And here in our communities, in our barrios here in the USA, language and slang has evolved and extended. We develop our own cultural language. Is it offensive, or the language of our culture? In our first session, a panelist shared that he was told by his grandchild's preschool that it was wrong for him to call his grandchild Icho. For him, it was an endearment. It was affectionate to call him a little bug. But he was told he couldn't do that. What I suspect is someone Googled it. So after he shared that story, I Googled it too. And I was shocked. I saw words like beast. I even saw a man's private part. Perhaps that's what the preschool did. So have the language police and others who are not of the same culture or use the same language have the right to dictate language to us. In this case, a Spanish speaker who used his own language was at risk to change the manner in which he spoke. So are we at risk to change our culture, and as a result of changing how we speak? Ana Sanchez Munoz, a professor at CSUN, holds a PhD as a linguist, and I consider her most definitely a foremost expert that can help us unwrap this. So she can speak on nearly every aspect of this topic. On the history, on the language, yes, there's a science to it even, and every aspect of this large topic. So Anna, let us know, while all of us in this room are not the experts that you are, and we're not academicians, so help us today by starting to break these questions down.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you so much, everybody. Should I use the mic? Yeah.
It's right there, right next to you.
I already see not enough problems.
Yes, can you hear me? All right. So I have a few notes just so that I don't forget what I want to cover. But thank you so much for starting with that story. That's fascinating. And you had told me this on the phone about the word bicho, right? Which for us is a little bug.
Yes.
But Spanish-speaking world is huge. 23 languages that claim it as an official language, and therefore the meanings change. Slang is very localized. So for us, that is a little bug. In other parts of the Spanish-speaking world, is not. And I could give many, many examples of that. But it is an example of, yes, the power of language, right? I have a colleague who's a very famous linguist, and he likes to start his talks by saying, when was the last time you had a problem and you said to yourself, gee, I need a linguist? Doesn't happen very often. And why? There's several reasons for that. The first one would be that our language was acquired before we have any memories. And also, and most importantly, because language is so ubiquitous, is everywhere. It's so common that we take it for granted. Yeah? But like my colleague says, we also take our doctor for granted when we don't know we have cancer. So what I'm here to tell you is about a different problem, maybe not of the physical health, but it could also imply the physical health. It's a problem of lack of understanding of language use and the cultural meanings of words. So these two issues are studied in the field of linguistics, two subfields of linguistics. Semantics, which is the area or the subfield that studies meaning, the meaning of words, texts, phrases, and pragmatics, which on the other hand studies the context. So how, when, what language we use, depending on the context in which it is used. And therefore, it is culture specific. Pragmatic is culture specific. And that means that these rules are going to change depending on the people, the languages. They will have different linguistic behaviors. So let me give you an example. Let's say somebody says, gee, that's a nice jacket you're wearing. That's a very nice jacket. What do you say? Thanks. It's a nice jacket. Is that something? You're welcome. Well, that would be terribly rude in other languages. So if you were given a compliment in French, what you would do is deflate the compliment. Oh, this jacket, this is horrible. It's had it for years. It's so old. It's terribly big-headed if you say thanks. So even though you may learn French, the rules of how, when to use what, that comes with the knowledge of the culture. Yeah? So that is why it is so important in a diverse setting such as Los Angeles. Pragmatics is crucial to understand one another. We tend to judge one another on our linguistic behaviors based on our own, other people's behaviors based on our own. That's what we do. That would work in a very homogeneous setting. However, when coexisting with several languages, several cultures,
He couldn't do that. What I suspect is someone Googled it. So after he shared that story, I Googled it too. And I was shocked. I saw words like beast. I even saw a man's private part. Perhaps that's what the preschool did. So have the language police and others who are not of the same culture or use the same language have the right to dictate language to us. In this case, a Spanish speaker who used his own language, was at risk to change the manner in which he spoke. So are we at risk to change our culture, and as a result of changing how we speak? Ana Sanchez Munoz, a professor at CSUN, holds a PhD as a linguist, and I consider her most definitely a foremost expert that can help us unwrap this. So she can speak on nearly every aspect of this topic. On the history, on the language, yes, there's a science to it even, and every aspect of this large topic. So Anna, let us know, while all of us in this room are not the experts that you are, and we're not academicians, so help us today by starting to break these questions down.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you so much, everybody. Should I use the mic? Yeah.
Yeah. It's right next to you.
I already see not enough problems.
Yes, can you hear me? All right. So I have a few notes just so that I don't forget what I want to cover. But thank you so much for starting with that story. That's fascinating. And you had told me this on the phone about the word bicho, right? Which for us is a little bug.
Yes.
But Spanish-speaking world is huge. 23 languages that claim it as an official language, and therefore the meanings change. Slang is very localized. So for us, that is a little bug. In other parts of the Spanish-speaking world, is not. And I could give many, many examples of that. But it is an example of, yes, the power of language, right? I have a colleague who's a very famous linguist, and he likes to start his talks by saying, when was the last time you had a problem and you said to yourself, gee, I need a linguist? Doesn't happen very often. And why? There's several reasons for that. The first one would be that our language was acquired before we have any memories. And also, and most importantly, because language is so ubiquitous, is everywhere. It's so common that we take it for granted. Yeah? But like my colleague says, we also take our doctor for granted when we don't know we have cancer. So what I'm here to tell you is about a different problem, maybe not of the physical health, but it could also imply the physical health. It's a problem of lack of understanding of language use and the cultural meanings of words. So these two issues are studied in the field of linguistics, two subfields of linguistics. Semantics, which is the area or the subfield that studies meaning, the meaning of words, texts, phrases, and pragmatics, which on the other hand studies the context. So how, when, what language we use, depending on the context in which it is used. And therefore, it is culture specific. Pragmatic is culture specific. And that means that these rules are going to change depending on the people, the languages. They will have different linguistic behaviors. So let me give you an example. Let's say somebody says, gee, that's a nice jacket you're wearing. That's a very nice jacket. What do you say? Thanks. It's a nice jacket. Is that something? You're welcome. Well, that would be terribly rude in other languages. So if you were given a compliment in French, what you would do is deflate the compliment. Oh, this jacket is horrible. It's been had for years. It's so old. It's terribly big-headed if you say thanks. So even though you may learn French, the rules of how, when to use what, that comes with the knowledge of the culture. Yeah? So that is why it is so important in a diverse setting such as Los Angeles. Pragmatics is crucial to understand one another. We tend to judge one another on our linguistic behaviors based on our own, other people's behaviors based on our own. That's what we do. That would work in a very homogeneous setting. However, when coexisting with several languages, several cultures,
And no one stood up. That was an opportunity to stand up to say, you know what? We have nuances in our language. And Changuito is not the Googled word that is a vile word in the African American community. I absolutely understand that. But there is a nuance that you don't understand. And that was the political lit match that changed years of hard work for representation of this Latino community. So with that very loaded question, I will turn that over to you, Anna.
thank you. Yeah, loads to unpack there, right? When we talk about words to refer to people, and going back to my presentation earlier about nicknames, apodos. Apodos or nicknames, they're used with very close people, with people that you know, that you trust. In my village, which was very homogeneous, calling somebody Ana la Negra because she was darker than me, and I was Anita because I was smaller, wouldn't be considered offensive. I still wonder if my friends that were called Ana la Gorda, Ana la Flaca, Ana la, physical attributes, they carried trauma. I still wonder that. I think that as we evolve as a society and realize the traumas that we inflict on future generations, and we take steps to correct that, the language follows. Language changes. Language is constantly changing, and it will continue to change, and the language belongs to the people. And now we're a lot more mindful, even in apodos amongst ourselves. Now, taking that out to a whole community, referring to people that you don't know by a nickname, that is very dangerous. You don't know them, you are assigning a value. Your words are a reflection of a value. This is what discourse is. Our beliefs, our set beliefs as our society come out in the way we present something, in the way we say something. And therefore, that is very problematic, especially in a very heterogeneous community, like Luis said, where we had many different types of people. That should never be, right? A word to represent a whole people. That doesn't happen to white people. Why? Because they have many stories that represent them. But minority communities tend to have a single story told to them from the majority, and that is what is very problematic. So how do we maintain our language? Well, our language changes. There's nothing we can do about it. We don't like change, but languages change. And that is the reality. Do we not use apodos, nicknames, cariños? Yes, but with those that you know, that you trust, very close to you. As an elected official, that was a very problematic move, but then, of course, there's many nuances, like you said. Why was this person being recorded? She probably wouldn't have said this if she knew she was speaking in public, right? So there are many, many nuances to that. That's absolutely true, but language changes and it will change. It doesn't change necessarily the character of it, but it changes the way we say something, right? And that's why the way we say things now is very different from the way we say things 40 years ago, referring to professions, for example, that were very gendered. Now we're trying to move away from that, and there's a reason for that, right? So I cannot give you a definite answer of what we can do, but it is true that having awareness, educating ourselves, goes a long, long way. It does. And again, this is very important because, as I said at the beginning, we use language all the time. We even use language when we're sleeping. It's 24/7, so we take it for granted. And we need to start looking at language as an object itself. So to be able to study, to understand it, to have better control of it. Yeah. So I think awareness of the words that we use goes a long, long way. And like Cesar said, when we say something that we regret because of the impact that it has, then you take responsibility.
So then, based on that big storm, right, political storm, we're not all answering the same question.
Yep.
Okay, we have several ones.
Cultures, several ways of understanding the world, that can be problematic. So let me give you another example. I lived in Glendale for many, many years. Glendale has a lot of Armenian population, right? So one time speaking with a friend from here, from the Valley, they told me, oh, but Armenians are so rude. And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? And they said, well, they speak so rough, and they don't always say please and thank you. So what this person was doing was judging somebody else's language according to their own pragmatics, according to their own linguistic use. We may speak English because it's our lingua franca, but we may still follow the pragmatic rules of our heritage languages and cultures, and that's what's going on there. Moreover, we live in a state where the two most numerous languages, in this case, would be Spanish and English, here in San Fernando and all over the state. But it is important to remember that they're both immigrant languages. Spanish is immigrant, English is immigrant. Spanish has been here 200 years before the arrival of English. It was the language that replaced indigenous languages, otherwise we would be speaking Tataviam right now, or Tongva, Fernandeño or Gabrieleño, according to how the Spanish called these languages. But eventually it was Spanish, the language of power. English took over, but still, Spanish is the language of a large, about 50% of the population, actually in California. So one of the things that we do in Spanish, like Diana has helped me to introduce, is apodos. Apodos are nicknames. And they are assigned to people because of some characteristic trait, right? While considered offensive in many modern societies, traditional villages all over Spain and Latin American countries that have Spanish as their official language use these apodos. So I'm going to give you another story. I come from a little village called Santa Ana. So the patron saint is Saint Anna. I am Anna. You can imagine every other woman is Anna in my village. So how do we distinguish one another? Well, in my group of friends, there was Ana la Gorda, Ana la Visca, Ana la Negra. I was Anita, thank God, because I was little. But we all get an apodo based on a characteristic. There was another thing, very funny too, that I'm going to share with you before I pass it on. There was a guy that was everywhere. You would see him everywhere with his bags. And we called him Dios, God, because he was everywhere. And one day he got lost, and the entire village was like, we lost God. ¿Dónde está Dios? You know, so these are the kind of apodos that we have, right? Nicknames. Being ignorant of these linguistic facts can lead people to judge too quickly the intent of the speaker, right? So while speakers in the US need to learn the pragmatic rules of English in this society, when speaking our heritage languages, like when I speak Spanish, we will continue using our linguistic behaviors, right? And of course, as in the case of the Armenian example I gave you earlier, this can lead to harsh or wrong assumptions on the speaker's intent. Another very important thing, and with this I close, is in my field we study things that are really, really, really important. So yes, you do need a linguist in your life, because there is something that can have big consequences: linguistic discrimination, which we call linguistic profiling. Research has found that many people make racist, snap judgments about people with diverse accents. And by accents, I mean we all have an accent, but if you don't have the standard American accent, you are judged more harshly, and this has consequences in all kinds of ways: potential employers, real estate agents, loan officers, health providers, right? So going back to the beginning of my talk, why does this matter? Why does the scientific study of the language matter? It matters precisely because language is such an integral part of being human. And as Gloria Anzaldúa says, ethnic identity is twin skin to my linguistic identity. I am my language. And that's that big part of our identity is our language. Thank you.
Sleeping on the job for a minute. I realized I got an earlier script, not the latest one. So thank you, Anna, for that. Next, we want to go to Luis. Luis is a longtime leader who's worked tirelessly for LA's indigenous community, including the growing Oaxacan community that has migrated from Mexico and Guatemala, who recently found themselves standing up and marching the streets following the wild insults that Nury Martinez spoke of their community that was secretly recorded. Luis advocates for indigenous peoples' rights, languages, and language revitalization. He has the huge job of interpreting and the responsibility of understanding those vast nuances we speak of. Their first language is their native indigenous language. Their second language is Spanish. And as they move to LA and other parts of the United States, learning a third language, English, making them contrary to how they're viewed and spoke of. They are among the most linguistically educated people in the world. The indigenous in Mexico and Central America have faced historic racism, persecution, elimination, and coming to this country, these latest scandals evident that they haven't escaped it. They have many struggles here. So Luis,
Thank you, and buenos dias, everyone. Good morning. Like Diana said, my name is Luis Lopez-Resendiz. I am the director of the Center for Indigenous Languages and Empower with Comunidades Indígenas en Liderazgo, which is an indigenous women-led organization working in South Central Los Angeles, a community that is home to many different indigenous communities from Central America and Mexico. I belong to the New Sabi community, which is a Mixtec. My family speaks Mixtec to Sabi. At CELO we work on visualizing the migrations of indigenous folks, indigenous communities to the United States, not to be confused with them being Latinos or Hispanics or any other identities out there that have been used. We do identify ourselves, I identify myself as a Mixtec man. CELO is located in South Central Los Angeles, which is unceded Tonga territory. For us, it's important to recognize that we are still in occupied indigenous lands. We are migrants, we are also indigenous, so it's important to recognize that. I think in this conversation on the audio links, it's important to note that the Latino politicians were talking about a community that is often being erased in history. You know, I studied history in college, and everything I learned was about a story that didn't represent me, didn't represent my community. You know, we have this idea that communities were disappeared a long time ago, especially the Mayan communities, that somehow we were taken by the aliens. There's some stories that talk about that our languages are not spoken, you know, that our languages are dying, when in reality, in my house, there's no other language that is being spoken other than Mixtec. And that same goes to different households of different indigenous migrants. When we listen to the audios of Nury Martinez and Kevin De Leon and the others, they were referring to the indigenous Oaxacan community in Koreatown. That's where I live. They were referring them to as Oaxaqueños, short, ugly Oaxacans. Nury Martinez did made a comment that, you know, now we were working in shoes, making the reference that, you know, now we were seen as civilized Indians. And for us, these conversations didn't surprise us because, unfortunately, in the greater Latino community, these are comments that are being used towards to identify indigenous communities, indigenous peoples. There's this idea that because we come from rural areas, we don't have the ability to create knowledge, the ability to be our own voice. So oftentimes we find people that want to speak for us, want to represent indigenous communities. These politicians, they went to many different communities and took pictures with the communities when they were doing their campaigns. There was a lot of frustration within the Oaxacan community because, many said, we consider them our allies. And unfortunately, when we are talking about allyship within the immigrant movement, we find a barrier as an indigenous organization, and that can be sometimes the racism and the discrimination that it keeps being reproduced within the Latino community. For us, it's important to talk about that because it keeps affecting, the migration and how history is being told towards indigenous communities. When these audience meetings were public, we organized with the Black community in response to the structural racism that exists within the Latino community. We were taken into a meeting where we were being called out for standing with the Black community. In a meeting, I remember that we were being told that it is because of indigenous peoples opposed to development that we couldn't get our things together. And now, in this struggle to call out racism within the Latino community, we were a rock, we were a challenge in the Latino progressive politics. So, in a really nasty meeting, we were called to, align with the Latino politics because we were calling out, the problems and the challenges that exist in the current Latino politics. So for us, that created a whole layer of struggle because there was a lot of community members that said that Kevin De Leon shouldn't resign. We're still calling for the resignation of Kevin De Leon. And for communities to really think on how we use certain words to describe people. Many times my family were called indios, patas rajadas, oaxaquitas, oaxaquitos. We have suffered, we have lived through many things. However, our community continues to organize. There's a really brilliant organization that happens within many indigenous communities. We come together to celebrate life, to party, to organize across borders. I think in the Caribbean they call it transnational indigenous organizations. My community is part of that process of organizing themselves. So in the city of Los Angeles, es casa común de muchas personas. It's a communal home of many different peoples, many different languages across the United States, and many different languages from across the world that exist in the city of Los Angeles. So the mission of Cielo is to be able to create spaces to visibilize this migration and to work so that we can create a home that welcomes everyone. In the work that we did during the pandemic, we created a map that is called We Are Here, and that talks about the presence of 17 indigenous languages that are spoken in Los Angeles County. And this is work that has been done for a very long time. I know there's a chief from the police station here. We have worked with the Los Angeles Police Department to create language cards that goes in English phonetics. So now, and this is after an incident that happened in 2010 where Maya Kichemen was unfortunately lost his life due to a misunderstanding. The Los Angeles Police Department didn't know that this person didn't speak Spanish because this person was from Guatemala. That ended up on, that cost the life of Manuel Jimenez Chun, And since then, we have been working to create language cards for every single police officer in the city of Los Angeles that identifies indigenous migrants and by who they are. So now we get calls by the police to ask us, I have this person who speaks a Mayan language, not to be confused with a dialect. A lot of people call indigenous language a dialect. And then, CLOC's work is to help facilitate communication between an indigenous interpreter and a person who doesn't understand those languages. I just want to leave it in there so that we can have more time for people. I'm grateful to be here. Somebody mentioned that it's the first time being in the San Fernando Valley. This is my first time being here. But indigenous peoples have been migrating to different parts of the county and across the United States. And it's important to talk about that because there's a lot of things that need to be fixed in order for us to serve those indigenous migrants who are arriving to our cities.
Thank you, Luis. You can clap.
And I remember the look of my friends. I broke her heart because we were good friends. Okay? I share their experience because, remember, sometimes we use erasing language. It doesn't make us a bad person, but it's a responsibility to rise above it and correct the wrongs. That's extremely important. And we do it by sharing our stories without judging, but rather trying to learn from each other, learn from somebody else's mistakes or the good things they do so we can do better in the future. Okay? My family is of mixed heritage in Mexico. My grandpa was, he claimed to be, in addition to being a Mexican indigenous person, he claimed to be half Chinese. I haven't gotten my DNA test yet, so maybe I have some Chinese in me. But he was proud of it. And my mother, well, we were like 5 brothers and all of different colors. I have a black brother, I'm the whitey in the family, and my 3 sisters are all shades of brown. I can tell you that I was treated differently because I was white. I know what privilege is based on being white. I was called El Güerito, the little whitey guy, but it sounded cute because I was white. That was why it sounded good. But my friend was never called Negrito. My friend was called El Negro. And we just use the language like, and sometimes it doesn't hurt. But we don't bother to ask people how they feel about how they are called. And it's important to keep that in mind before we do it. In Mexican culture, we grow up to accept some of the terms because they might not be necessarily pejorative. But we need to understand and know whether those people being addressed by those names, how they feel about it. That's extremely important. We need to educate ourselves and listen to others. Okay? As a reporter, I realize how powerful language is in that sense, and how long we have to go as a society to overcome some of those issues dealing with the language and how it impacts people. And that's the reason I said to Diana, I was here at the previous panel covering it, and I said, I need to share my experience because I think people can learn from it. Okay, so if you have any questions, I'm here to answer. I'm a reporter, I know how powerful words are. We need to understand culture, we need to understand the nuances of the language, and hopefully we'll be able to enlighten each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Cesar, for that wonderful testimonial. So now I want to each try to efficiently ask you a question based on this very complex topic that has many tentacles, right? And while we are having the privilege of really kind of trying to begin to unpack these issues within our own community, we also know externally, because of how we are viewed externally during Trump and COVID, we certainly heard those horrible, horrible use of terms that he used to define us and to define the Asian community. I don't need to repeat them, but the impact that they made. And as a result, there were hate crimes and actual violence that occurred, and the fallout continues. So Anna, when you sweepingly refer to a group with the use of slur, and that list is very long, you do dehumanize. People no longer consider the member of that group as a person, as a human, and it becomes easier to dismiss them, to look down on them, and even harm them. So how do we maintain what's good about our language versus the harm that our language can do? Is it perhaps standing up when we're justly having our language incorrectly viewed? So how do we change when the aspects of our language are harmful? Is it simply enough to educate for people to be responsible for what you say, especially when these use of terms become generational, they're handed down, right? And Martha knows because we had these discussions, I was very appalled to hear people in this community very freely using terms that I thought were the most abhorrent and disgusting, referring to immigrant community as chunts, chunte. It's so low. And my reaction was to view that person as being very low. A principal recently shared with Martha that her kids at her school use the N-word frequently. And that has been passed on to them by someone. So Anna, when we talk about these things and trying to discern and unpack which are cariños and which is very hurtful and damaging, and we, in our last panel, discussed Nury Martinez a little bit more, and the use of the word changuito, which I will stand by, and I was probably the only journalist that spoke to her afterwards. And that use of the term for her was discussing behavior, how the child was running around on that parade float. No one will defend the things she said about the indigenous community in Koreatown. But for the use of the term changuito, that is a different situation. And for the Black community, it became the lit match that was used as for political opportunity to take over the Fed. And people have stopped and not thought about how this was a well-planned situation and people were illegally recorded. I will not defend Nury about the indigenous community at all. But I want people to really think about what occurred so that we no longer have the political power, the city council, we have no one sitting as the president, and no one bothered to come to this community and ask this community, which was represented by her, what they thought. But the world weighed in, including ridiculously President Biden, who knows nothing about this community. Okay? So as a result, $7.5 million was spent for a special election. And we are awaiting those results right now. So when we talk about the power of words, that's huge. So getting back to my question, about the cultural aspects and how do we create the change to discern that. And it was very disappointing and I am saying this myself, to watch supposed Latino leaders all fold like an umbrella, and watch the difference when the African American community all stood up for Mark Ridley Thomas in defending his good track record. And the difference was everyone was so anxious to write letters for Nuri to resign. Everyone. Anna Sharon, even members of the most progressive Chicano Studies department in this country, were quick to write those letters. Fails, and he got a big laugh out of it, and he even had a little song that he sang, and got the biggest laugh out of it, and and we knew it was affectionate, and it wasn't anything that made me feel negative. There are so many stories. Ruben the last time talked about growing up and the conflict he had with Black and brown community, and one of the guys in your neighborhood, right, who was very slow, and you all called him Rapido, right? And people knew, the nuance and the humor and the wit, and there's a lot of wit, a lot of sharp wit that comes with these terms, right? So I guess what I am trying to point out is that unfortunately sometimes in our community, when someone from the outside takes issue with that, we're so quick to fold rather than stand up and say, wait a minute, you just don't understand it. You're not a Spanish speaker, you didn't grow up in this culture, so who are you to dictate how I should speak?
I agree with that, and like I said, it's not like you can abuse the term. You can refer to your child like that. Your intent is not offensive to your child, to your family member, to people in the community, but using it to refer to somebody outside of the community might be very problematic.
Right, but the difference was she was among her colleagues who were also Latino who understood that use of the term.
Yeah, but
when it was secretly recorded and got out. But again, there's no justification of the other things that were said. And I will let you speak even though I'm speaking too much and you're dying to comment about this, but I have another question for you, Caesar. So go ahead.
Just to follow up on what you were saying, I was called a changuito many times in Mexico because I would just jump around like all crazy with a lot of energy, and so was my brother. So it was never understood as a racial term. Although it makes me think twice about it to call my brother, who passed away already, a changuito, not because I guess I've learned from all the current experiences that it can be an offensive term, and we never asked him how he felt about it. And we do know that some people in Mexico have used it also as a racial term. Very few. For the most part, it means, a very hyperactive kid. But we need to definitely understand culture, the value that is assigned, and at the same time realize that, when cultures meet in a city like Los Angeles, sometimes it's a clash. And we better learn from that clash. And I guess the lesson potentially for some politicians is like, don't use language so loosely because you might be being recorded. I mean, I guess that's the lesson. And on the other hand is be as kind and considerate as possible so you don't offend people even when you don't mean to.
I guess the point is all of this gives us pause. And I don't know if we start our meetings by looking for bugs in the room as well, but it gives us pause to consider this. But my concern, I guess, is the loss of culture, because language is our culture, shapes our culture. And who but ourselves has a right to the maintenance of our culture? So Luis, the community of Koreatown is the center for LA's indigenous community. What do you think is needed most? That horrible situation did put a spotlight on the community that many don't even still know how vibrant it is and how important it is and how much it's grown. Some of us have spoke of the need for electing an Indigenous resident to City Hall. What is your point of view about that?
I think what is needed the most is to really rethink the way we refer to certain communities in the language that we grew up speaking with. Because this term, changuito, it is racist. It is really racist. It's not a fact that this conversation happening privately or not. The way we refer to people is racist. And let's call it out. Nuri is racist. Kevin De Leon is racist. And all these elected officials that were taking part in that conversation is racist. You think if they were so comfortable speaking in a private room like this, what does it mean to have these conversations in public? How does this reflect on the way they run, a campaign on, this issue? It may be normal for people because we grew up accustomed to this, but let's rethink, we grew up accustomed to speaking in a very racist way of certain individuals. As certain individuals, so it is a conversation that needs to happen, The main thing that needs to happen in Los Angeles is to have the Latino community reflect on how they use language to speak about the Asian community, Asian Pacific Islanders, the Black community, the Indigenous community. Yes, our grandmas, our grandpas spoke different like this about people, but we keep reproducing that, and there's a conversation that needs to happen. The how language was composed in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Central America, across Latin America, to identify or to erase a certain population of people. There were campaigns to try to get rid of indigenous communities, to educate the indigenous person so that they can think the way the white Latinos, white Mexicans wanted to run a country on. So those are conversations, and I know it's uncomfortable, and we have been in situations where these conversations get uncomfortable, but it's the reality of things. We all know, or we all have the auntie, the tío that talks about indigenous folks in a different way, Indios, uneducated folks, about Black communities, calling them morenos, using this racial, really violent terms, and this is why at Cielo we call this language violence, because it's a violence that keeps reproducing, that it is important to talk about, because we're not going to go nowhere if we think, okay, we can't talk about certain things in private because we might be, there might be somebody listening to us, Better to rephrase that and say, we must really analyze how we use language, because it comes from a really racist history, and this is something that needs to be acknowledged at the dinner table, We have all, I'm pretty sure if we go through our family's phone contacts, there's somebody who is going to be named El Moreno, and people might think, that's not racist because that's just a funny way to call on someone. No, that's racism. That's racism. That is something that needs to be examined and really think about, because if there's something that is really affecting communities, is the way, Latino community has been using language to refer about other people and not willing to change. Because if my community as an indigenous community learn to speak Spanish to communicate those needs, it is important for communities that are not indigenous to learn the importance of making sure that we are creating a safe space for everyone and that we welcome people into this city. It's not a matter of having an elected official that is indigenous, but it is a matter of talking about how racism works in different spaces, from the white and the Latino community that is becoming a majority in the country. These are spaces that these conversations don't have to happen just in the city of Los Angeles, but across the United States, because it's the same conversation. We experienced racism in Mexico. I grew up in Mexico speaking my own language and being called different names. I came here and the racism that we experience in the predominant Latino community is the same as we experience there. So I think that is a conversation that needs to happen, because this language that we think is normal and is commonly used and is not racist, is racist.
Thank you very much for that. And I also want to say, and forgive me for this going much longer, but it is important discussion. And what you're talking about is that difficult discussion that we're trying to have now. You know, as a U.S. born, and I self-identify as a Chicana, going to Mexico, I am completely discriminated against. You know, my Spanish is laughed at, I'm referred to as a pocha, and the way I get my head around it, and you know, and I was there for many significant events, including the first women's tribe, International Women's Tribunal, and I argued with Betty Friedan and all these white women who all got in these exclusive meetings where decisions were made, and we were divided. So the racism that I felt from people of various classes in Mexico was horrendous. And I had to say, I have every right to be here. And people said everything from your family were traitors and, you know. But what I came to realize is that there was some jealousy involved. And those people who were quote unquote from a higher culture, and I'm very brown, right? Had a problem with the fact that my family could come across and have its own history of, you know, I am third generation on my mother's side, and my father and his family's from Guanajuato and very brown, and I have an African-Mexican grandfather. What disturbed them was that in this very short period of time, I could come back and have equality with them. And I could financially buy a house. I had as much money in my pocket, and I was educated. Something that the indigenous community struggled to have. And it irked them a lot. So there's so many layers of this to discuss and unpack. And yes, that's why we are having this discussion. We wrote this grant specifically for this. No one else had written a grant like this. And I wrote a book years ago called Covering LA's Majority, for newsrooms to cover the use of terms correctly and the education that we all need to have. One disturbing, we all have many disturbing stories, but when I was first entered a CBS News Radio, KFWB, I had to contend with the most horrendous racism with a very popular news anchor, and I was his superior, who thought it was important to tell me that a bunch of wetbacks were crawling on his hillside right now. And I had the choice of, okay, do I stop what I'm doing to correct him and educate him and tell him I'm offended? Or do I do what a lot of Latino journalists do still to this day, which is to conform to that newsroom culture and environment? And I had to contend with that. I was going to be that one in the room, right? There she goes again, right? And it was part of my job to do that education. So all of this, as you said, we come from different places and life experiences, and because of our own life experiences, we have different points of view about these things. And that's why this conversation is so important. I know, Anna, you have writing some notes, and I do want to hear from those too, but our audience has been waiting a long time, and I want to get to Caesar's question right now. Maybe we can veer back to your point. Caesar, in private conversations that we've had, you spoke of your dark-skinned brother that you had, right? And I'm curious to know, do you feel that the messages given to you, you know, calling you güero, or however you were viewed as white, and somehow white people still to this day in Mexico are always just viewed naturally as more attractive just because they're white, which, you know, absolutely is ridiculous. So, but do you think the messages given to you gave you more confidence and reassurance that you could and do in fact express your talents and have more privilege as compared to your dark-skinned brother? What was the impact of those differences as siblings and the messages given to you and him?
Well, like some of my colleagues here already mentioned, intention matters a lot.
Use a mic.
Is it still working? I think better maybe down. I'll try to be louder. Intention matters. I don't think that the word güero or negro, referring to me as a white kid and my brother as a black, based on physicality or race or appearance, was racial. It was a term of endearment. However, again, there's so many layers and nuances. We could not ignore that. I could not ignore that I was treated differently. I loved working in the fields because I could make a few dollars, during vacation. Oh, no, but Caesar, you don't have to go to the field. No, you're gonna go to school and be somebody. My brother didn't have that conversation. He was expected to do it because he was black. We came down to that. And so it's when it comes to nicknames, it's tricky. And I found fascinating the point that she just gave us, that the intentionality of language is also very important. But as our world gets global, we need to learn those nuances, because otherwise we can end up in trouble. We can hurt people. We can lose a job, and if you're a politician, you're out of work. So intentionality is important. But when it comes to Mexico and most of Latin America, is we have this ingrained, very subtle and not so subtle racism that raises its very ugly head openly once in a while. Not long ago, when we had a Mexican actress, Yalitza Aparicio, nominated for an Oscar, we had some Mexican actors referring to her pejoratively as an Indian, like she wasn't worth it of being getting nominated for an Oscar. And the jealousy, yeah, that's what it was, but it was expressed with open racism, fast. But as a point of history, curiously, in Mexico, we have had at least two presidents of Indian ancestry, very clearly. Benito Juarez, which was a legendary politician, and the first Mexican president, Vicente Guerrero, was of African ancestry. His nickname was El Negro. And it's very complex, but it's a conversation that we have to have. And the one thing interesting that I found out about Mexico and the U.S., that here I realized that the clash for civil rights took place because black people and minorities were not willing to take it anymore. It's like, no, it's unfair, and we'll have to change it. In Mexico, that's never happened. We're a mestizo culture, so you adapt. You become, you acculturize to the majority mestizo culture. And we seduce racist language. We need to acknowledge our privilege, whatever your background is, and how that colors what you do and how you treat other people. It doesn't make you, again, many of us use racist language not because we're bad people. Racism is something learned. So if it's learned, good news, it can be unlearned. That's a secret, and we need to do that. But we need to be willing. And sometimes we need, the reason I share this personal experience, and here I go again, with this is because we need to learn from each other and learn from the mistakes. Because otherwise, we're going to be talking past each other. In the case of my brother, going back to the subject, is that racism was expressed in different levels. And I personally believe that he was impacted in a traumatic fashion without him even knowing it. And that's part of my language. That's fucking tragic. How could we allow a very talented man like my brother was able to become an aviator with the military, who was so freaking good with his hands, who could make a freaking water heater. He was a teenager making a water heater for the family. So talented. And I felt that because we treated him differently, unconsciously, because he was black, he couldn't go far. He tried, but it still got in the way, but he was never talked about. Even today when I talk to the family and I talk about those issues, My brother came to the States and he couldn't last long. How? Talk about being Mexican of black ancestry in Los Angeles. Good luck. Yeah, that's the life that he faced. He never talked about it. We have to. We have to, because otherwise we're going to be destroying people's lives, and that's not acceptable. Period. But let's get ourselves ready to have this sort of uncomfortable conversations because they are very, very helpful. It'll tell us, it'll enlighten us what kind of biases we have, and then you'll say, okay, I know that I use racist language. I need to get better at it, to know that sometimes I use it without knowing. So you'll be on the lookout to make sure that you change, that you challenge yourselves. Okay? Sometimes, I mean, talking to my family, are they going to acknowledge that I'm racist? Am I going to have the conversation right away? No, sometimes it takes time to educate. I have some friends who are freaking racist here, and they love me, but they love me because I'm a white Mexican. And I go, will they love me if I were a black Mexican or a dark-skinned Mexican of Indian ancestry? If I have it, but I don't look it? I know that I wouldn't be treated the same way. That's how racism works. It's very insidious. And we need to know that it's there so we can work on it. That's one of the only ways, not one of the only ways, but one of the best ways to address it, starting with it.
Thank you. We want to open it up to the audience. And this topic is so deep, and talking to Lalo Garcia, which is a very, very renowned, and he was also going to be a member of this panel, one of the most popular mariachi groups is Los Changuitos, right? And a popular, Feos, yes, and a very popular black mariachi singer. I forget her name now, sorry. So this thing is, very deep, and that's why I was trying to ask Anna, is education in itself, or as Luis points out, going back to its original source? And when does it become acceptable that should never have been acceptable in the first place? You're talking about trying to break a chain generationally, such a strong force. And then among externally, people who are white, and what is the use of the term again? I'm sorry, I just did it. They will compliment you, but it really won't be a compliment. Oh, you speak such good English. Well, for me, it's like, actually, that was my predominant language growing up, for many Chicanos, and the worst thing that happens to us is that we begin to lose language, and that's devastating, right? So let's open it up to the audience, and thank you all for your patience, because Evelyn wants to speak first, so let's go.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. This is a really interesting conversation. I was here for the first one, and I thought it was equally interesting. There were two concepts that I was thinking about. One, Anna, you brought up, which is, you were talking about like accents, and more importantly, when immigrants come to this country, you said, they learn, let's say, English. They are speaking English, but from the perspective of their culture, right? So they may not always come across the way that, let's say, more usual users of the language would by then. And that was interesting because Luis said the language we're using in Spanish is racist. And I agree with you, Luis, 100%. And in fact, I said that last time and some people got mad and left. But I agree with you. And so my question to both of you is, where do we start? Do we start from the culture understanding that the language is racist? Or do we start from understanding that when we get here, we got to be careful with how we use that language from a cultural perspective in the new setting, or is it both? Thank you.
I think it is important to have these conversations in our homes on how racism, or what, start unwrapping what racism is. And, you know, and take a look at the history of how, you know, I'm just going to speak on the case of Mexico, how Mexico was created. You know, we had a caste system. You know, we can talk about what the caste system is, where you had, you know, and I'm pretty sure if you speak Spanish, a lot of people have used this term of mejor la raza, you know, better the race. Marry somebody lighter than you so that your kids can be white and cute, right? And there's this idea. When you look in the media, you're never gonna see somebody who is a dark-skinned person, you know, and when you look at the telenovelas, you know, so everything is about this white-looking Mexican and these European beauty standards that many people, you know, want to, you know, reach. You know, they want to be able to have that in the home. You know, be able to, you know, there's this conversation is if you look at the conversation in history, you know, nobody really talks about that indigenous ancestry. They always want to talk, oh, my grandma was an immigrant from Spain that came into this country, or my grandpa was an immigrant from Spain. You know, and we always have this idea that everything white is better. You know, and my apologies for everyone political, but that is the reality of things. You know, everything white. Who is the knowledgeable person? The person that has a degree from a white institution, a person that looks whiter than the rest of them. And that's that reality, you know. When you have kids, you know, growing up, you look at the little white kid, oh, that's a cute baby. But when you look at it, you know, when families and the Mexican families, they get to that, no, ese salió morenito, you know. That one is darker skin, so that is not cute. You know, so those conversations, analyzing that, Mexico was built to, you know, this identity. There's this famous, the father of education in Mexico that I don't really agree with, you know, Jose Vasconcelos, had this idea that Mexico was going to be a mestizo nation, that, you know, erasing the fact that indigenous people were still there. And the fact that, you know, there was black Mexicans, that were black people that were kidnapped and taken to Mexico. You know, and this idea that, oh, I took a lot of Chicano studies classes to understand this idea of what is la raza de oro, or what this raza cósmica raza is, but always erasing the fact that we were still there, you know, that indigenous people were still there. So taking a look at how history was made in Mexico, and analyzing and having those uncomfortable conversations, because, you know, I read that essay about la raza cósmica, and I was like, this is not me, you know. This person was crazy to the end. The people that pushed that in the education system in Mexico, pushed it to de-indigenize the indigenous communities so that everybody can speak Spanish and reproduce this idea that you are no longer indigenous, now you're a mestizo person. You know, in my family that has always been a resistance. You know, I went home after being in college. I went home to my dad. I think we're mestizos, Dad. He's like, no, you're crazy. We are not mestizos. And this is what they teach us in school, you know. And then it's a way my dad always told me, you know, you have to remember who you are, and not, you know, you're going to school to learn on how to, you know, understand how they think of the world. But you know who we are, and we are always gonna be Mixtecos. We're always gonna be Mixtecos. We're always gonna keep our language alive. You know, they fail at trying to killing us. We are, you know, this is resistance. This is what resistance is like. And it only lasted for one day after I read, you know, these identities things. And you know, it was, you know, everything starts at home. You know, education is not something you learn in school. It's something that you learn at home, and that's where it begins.
That
Well, it's not. Can you give it to her?
so just like Mexico, you said that it was a caste system. The United States is a racist system.
The whole foundation of the United States is racist. So what I was going to say when you said, should we change the language first, or educate about the language first, or the culture? Language does not exist without people. We are intrinsically linguistic beings. Humans are intrinsically linguistic. So when you change the culture, you're changing the language with it. It doesn't go separate. Language doesn't exist in a vacuum. So one things that of the things that we do in linguistics, and one of the new areas, and to go back to what Luis was saying, is racial linguistics. Anything that you say about a language, you're saying about that person. Whatever your statement you're saying about the linguistic features, the linguistic behaviors of a person, you're saying it of who they are as a whole. So what we think about a race transposes into language. It's a very subtle way of doing racism. You know, not giving somebody a job. It's not because they are darker or black, it's because I couldn't understand them very well. Okay, it's the same. The transposition between the person and the language is one. So you need to change that to change the language. And it takes forever. So 40, 50 years is not going to do it. Yeah.
Maybe Cheryl, you need the microphone? Probably.
Thank all of you. It's completely fascinating what I'm hearing. I wanted to say just a couple of things. One is about intentionality, and it does matter. However, the receiver of your words does not necessarily know what your intention was. So they could be insulted even though you don't mean to, right? Another thing is, I was thinking in terms of generationally how this works. My own parents didn't speak English as their first language, and when they got married, my mother said they almost put it in the wedding ceremony that they would never speak anything but English in their home with me, because they had suffered so much as children. And that's so generational, I mean, that's so typical of the generations, and so they didn't want. So I grew up only speaking English, okay? I learned Spanish as an adult. My family was not raised like my own children speak both languages, right? So when they started teaching other languages in schools, that helped to break that pattern. That not only taught a language, that taught respect, that taught honor, that taught why you should honor the people that speak whatever language you're talking about. Parents have said to me, my daughter was never able to speak to her grandmother. Now she can. And they're just immensely grateful for that, right? And just the last thing was one of the things that will save this all is ethnic studies. Because you have students who are the ethnicity of the core course, and you have students who are other things studying that. And so that is the thing, I think, formally, that will help change how people regard other.
Thank you. A bit of a challenge for four of you is, without looking at your phone, can you write down the definition of racism? And will you all four have the same definition, maybe similar definitions? But it begs the question, if you are ignorant of the word racism, can you call somebody a racist? How many layers to that word are there if somebody is truly ignorant of it? Basically what I'm trying to say is, maybe we should stop pointing fingers at people and calling them racist, and maybe we should try to educate ourselves as to what it really means.
Can we also take another question, so maybe they can umbrella them and Ruben, yeah. So maybe you can write them down and then we've got address them.
Do you need an answer? Judge, do you need an answer?
Do I need an answer?
No, we'll come back with it. Some want to get through them. But some people had to leave, and I kind of knew their questions, so I'll ask those to you. But go ahead, Ruben.
You know, it's, from an academic point, you know, it kind of gets very complicated. But for the purpose, I think, of what the intent was here with the Nuri and, you know, the political fallout of all that, is that, to me, it's the power of emotion behind the word. You know, there's that science fiction book and movie, Dune. I don't know if anybody ever saw it. There's the old one and the new one. In the old one, there was a weapon there that was like a sound amplifier. That was actually, you would kind of make a noise with your mouth, it would amplify it and kill your enemy, right? So I think intentionality is critical, especially the way it's used in the political sense. Because what happened here, somebody took advantage of what happened there, things that everybody does, you know, in the African American community. Look, I experienced it growing up, and we all do, you know. The N-word was used between the African American community, kind of like common, like we would say, hey, dog, you know, like I saw some of my nephews call each other dog, you know, it became very common. If I had said it at that time, could have gotten beat up or killed, you know, because I was not part of that inner group. Now, this caste system that, you know, los pobres y los ricos, you know, in my family, clearly indigenous on one side, and, you know, you know, on my grandmother's side, they were the rich class, you know. So we grew up, I don't identify as indigenous anymore, I identify as mestizo, I guess, you know, or mixed, you know, because we've lost that language. Outside of aguacate and chiquihuite, I really don't know, you know, Nahuatl, you know, we've lost that. But I think I would just like to say for everybody dealing with the issue, what happened with Nuri and everybody there, everybody else does it. Because I've been part of that redistricting process, and I know everybody that wants power in their community uses that word. I mean, that's the reason redistricting exists. We would talk about black community. We would talk about us and how we needed a majority in those districts so we could have representation. And I go back to 1984 here, when we got the first Latino elected here in about 30 years, even though we were at 70% of the population, you know. So this was clearly a political grab. That LA Times, I mean, you guys know, you heard of yellow journalism against the Asian community? It was clearly brown journalism. It framed everybody in our community as racist. It wasn't just Nuri and everybody else. You know, those series of articles blasting them was in the context, you know, that Trump uses, you know, for you know, the other immigrant community, what Fox News does. You know. So I think we need to deal with it academically, but very, very clear on how it's weaponized and is used by people that are grabbing power or want power. So we need to rise to that level of political sophistication and understand that dynamic so that we can be clear on what's going on. Because it clearly affects us. It was clearly a power grab, and I'm sorry, our political leadership fell into it and threw Nuri and everybody else under the bus. And I think I'm glad Kevin de Leon held out. Because, you know, you saw what happened with the other councilman. Same people. There's a word in the language, hypocrisy. You know, we have to be very clear on the political hypocrisy.
I think Javier was next. Yes.
Well, yes, I think that culture is really important, but also that we need to look at the action point that Ruben mentioned. The fact that it's just shown, not only to Los Angeles, but to the whole world, that as Latinos or Mexicanos or Latinx, whatever you want to call us now, every single term is done by somebody else, but not by us, or given to us by somebody else. We are not together. We have not been working together, and maybe that's where the clash is also, and the misunderstanding also that we have among ourselves. And as Latinos, I think that's what we failed. We have a better understanding that instead of supporting our own people, meaning all of us that live among each other, we ran away. Everybody split, and then everybody, it's like holding something, a sphere, on the air, and everybody splits out, and that sphere just fell down. And that's what we are right now.
Anybody else? Sheila?
This may sound like I'm taking the conversation in a different direction, but I'm not actually. I'm from the East Coast, and when I moved here, I became friends with a woman my age who had grandchildren. And one of the things that, well, we became good close friends, but at one point
she started talking very casually, as she would with a family member, about issues in the community and about whatever. Anyway,
Hold it high, hold it closer to you.
when she first made this statement, I brushed it off. It's just her, exactly. The issue was this: she had 2 grandchildren. One was dark, one was light. She happened to be Diana's complexion. The daughter was about my complexion, and the grandson was Diana's complexion. And she said, and she was talking about the birthday party that one of them had, and she said, Maria, the girl, I'm choosing a name here, the daughter do, and then darker people have,